All right. Welcome, everyone, to our February Book Club Author Talk. So today we're here with Marcia Moran, and her book is Stroke Forward. And I'm trying to read it backwards in my computer. How to become your own healthcare advocate one step at a time. So that was our book for February. So welcome, Marcia.
Thank you, Amy.
So let's just do a recap. Some of the people watching have read your book, and some probably have not read your book.
Okay.
So let's give a recap of your injury and what happened to you.
Okay. So I woke up and it was a Sunday morning and I felt weird. So I reached over and texted my friend because I was supposed to have breakfast with her and I obviously wasn't going to make it. And the text came out looking funny. So I went, oh, I'll just text her later. And I put the phone down. I rolled over and I got the worst headache imaginable. And despite all the pain, I went to sleep. The next time I woke up, I was paralyzed from the top of my head to the tip of my toes on the right-hand side. And I knew that if I didn't get up then, I might not get up at all. So I rolled off the bed and reached for the carpet and pulled myself towards the door. And when I finally got to the door, I had to reach up, but I couldn't quite make it all the way. So I don't even know how many times I tried, but I finally snuck it open. And I was so tired that I just laid there for a while because I had no energy left.
Mm-hmm.
So when I finally had enough energy to move, I slowly made my way down the hall until I couldn't make it any further. I just collapsed. And I thought my husband would come up for soda sometime, but I don't know what it was, but something went crash. And Jim came upstairs to see what was going on, and he found me and he said, Marcia, are you okay? And I said, nothing. He said, can you talk to me? And I said, nothing. And finally he said, I'm going to dial 911. And I nodded. And that was the first time actually, the ambulance arrived, and one of the first messages out of one of the paramedics' mouths was, when should she have the stroke? And that was the first time we even thought of the word stroke. And we were devastated because I was only 53. I was in good health. I had normal cholesterol. And so it was a fluke. I should have had a stroke, but I did.
Yeah. And I think that brings up a really important point is we need to erase the stigma that strokes are only for older people, because they can happen at any age. I've met kids as young as 7 and 8 who've had a stroke.
Yes.
So we tend to think of it as something our grandparents would have, but the reality is it can happen at any age.
And for no reason.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What year was that for you?
2014.
So you're coming up on your six-year anniversary.
Yep. So I celebrate the anniversary of my stroke as my second birthday because I think I have a reason to celebrate. I mean, I could have died and I didn't. So I'm doing everything I can to make sure that every day I live is as good as I can make it.
Yeah. Yeah. And thank goodness your husband was home.
Oh, yeah.
He might not have come up soon enough, but at least he was home.
Yeah.
Miss Pixie seems to want to make an appearance here.
Okay.
So I've had numerous people on my podcast who have had strokes, like young people in their 20s, and they went home for lunch because they weren't feeling well.
Right.
And by stroke of luck, their husbands were home for lunch. Like they normally didn't go home, but they just happened to that day. And had they not been home, who knows if they'd still be here.
Yeah.
Because
It's
I think,
terrible.
that's the devastating part of a stroke is you yourself can't do anything.
Right.
One of my favorite books was My Stroke of Insight.
Hmm.
I can never remember her name. Um,
Jill Bolte Taylor.
yes, thank you.
Yep.
I never can remember. I always want to say Janet. But that was one of my favorite books because it was one of the first books I read in my recovery. And, while I didn't have a stroke, I could still totally relate to how her recovery felt.
Yep.
But just how she knew she was having a stroke.
Hmm.
And she was very aware that this was happening to her, but she couldn't dial the phone. She couldn't talk. She somehow managed, to get to the door. Yeah,
Yep. So that is actually the first book I read after I came home from the stroke.
it's a great
And
book.
it's a great book.
It's, like I said, I didn't have a stroke, so that wasn't how I related to it, but just her positivity.
Hmm.
And one of the things I really took away from her book was when she was in the hospital and doctors and nurses would come in and she still couldn't talk. And she could tell the second they came in the room from their energy if they're going to be a
Hmm.
good or a bad nurse. Because they'd
Hmm.
either yell really loud to try to talk to her, or they'd turn the lights down and touch her and how are you today? And
Yep.
that really resonated with me for anybody who's dealing with someone who's possibly in a coma
Right.
or has just come out of a stroke and how
Yep.
to approach that.
Yep.
So how long were you in the hospital?
I was in the hospital until Thursday. So Sunday to Thursday.
So not quite a week.
Yeah. And
And then
then,
were you sent home or did you go to a rehab facility?
so I went to a rehab facility and they told me I'd be there for a week. And it turns out I was there for 2 weeks. And after the rehab hospital, I went home and had home health care. And the thing that I dislike the most is when you're on home health care, you can't go out to eat.
Oh,
And that's really a big deal for people who now I wasn't cooking. But I had home health care for 6 weeks. I had 2 weeks off, and then I had 2 months of rehab hospital as an outpatient.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I still felt like I needed rehab, so I actually hired a physical therapist for another year who worked with me to get me walking. They say it's correctly, so if somebody sees me on the street, they don't know I had a stroke,
Yeah.
but I'm still not in sync.
Mm-hmm.
So I do some things very badly, like running.
But hey, you try.
Yeah.
um, so at what point did you start working on this book?
So I started Stroke Forward 1 year after my stroke, and I revised it a number of times because one, I typed really slowly. And the first time around, when I reread the whole thing, there was absolutely no emotion in it. So I set it aside for about 6 months and I picked it up and I tried editing it. And I had some emotion, but when it came to talking about my family, I couldn't say what it really felt for me. So I put it aside again because obviously I wasn't ready to talk about it. And then I picked it up a third time and I rewrote it again. And that's when I let the floodgates open. I'm not sure I was as forthright with them as I need to be, but I feel like I'm close enough that I just felt like I need to get it published because at that time it had been 4 years since I'd been writing it.
So when you talk about it didn't have emotion, did you feel that your personality lacked emotion as well, like in your everyday life?
So I felt emotion, but I couldn't communicate it on paper. And I think that's a disconnect. So I knew that in order for people to want to read the book, one, it had to excite me as well. And when I read it, it's like, I'm just not interested in reading it. There's something missing here. Um, and maybe I didn't have as much emotion in the beginning as the emotion I had at the end, but I still felt some. So it was just maybe that was part of my aphasia, I don't know.
Hmm. Yeah, I know for me, for probably 2 years, I felt like I really didn't have a personality. Like I felt my personality had really gone away,
Yeah.
and it was very flat. It was like almost like I was constantly monotone.
Mhm.
Like I didn't get excited, but I also didn't get angry. I just
Mhm.
kind of stayed in this very flat zone.
Yeah.
Um, so, I'm curious if maybe you were experiencing some of that as well. Um,
So the interesting thing about that is at almost 3.5 years after, I think it was 3.5, no, 2.75 years after the stroke, I finally got angry with my husband. And that was quite a surprise to him. But um, I finally think that I was looking at most of the stuff he does is so piddly when it comes to emotion. I have nothing to get mad about it because that is, it's not worth getting mad about. But
mhm.
finally, he asked me for directions and I couldn't communicate fast enough for him. And he got a little mad at me and then I blew up with him. So it's like, really? Directions. That is such a small thing, but that's what got me.
So, what was your catalyst for wanting to write this book? Um, it's basically a survival guide for other survivors on how to advocate for their health care. But what were some obstacles you went through that kind of catapulted you into wanting to publish this?
Well, the first thing is that neither one of us knew anything about advocacy. And so I was in the hospital and I had been just admitted to the patient room, and the nurse took me into the bathroom and hurried out to make my bed. And I had no muscles on my right hand side, so I went, and the nurse ran into the bathroom with my husband behind her. And so nothing was hurt or hurt more than it was.
Right.
I'm sorry. And that's when my husband realized that somebody had to take care of me. So I think it was the next day, I was supposed to drink liquids, right? So I drank liquids because I had no choking sensors.
Mm,
So
hmm.
if I had something in my throat and swallowed it wrong and it went into my lungs, I could actually die from that. So they gave me liquids. I was supposed to drink it straight ahead, and I moved my head to the left when I needed to swallow because my right hand side had very little movement. So the kitchen actually sent me chicken by surprise, and I was really excited. It's like, ooh, chicken. So I dug into it, took a bite, and choked, of course. And yeah, exactly. And I don't know what they did to get it out. I don't remember that part. But that was another point where he said, I've really got to watch everything that they do because I almost lost my wife. So he learned advocacy every day. And when I got home, I realized that people need to have a guidebook to go by, because the last thing you want to do when you're in a hospital in our situation is learn that one day at a time. I can give you a guidebook. It won't have all the answers, but at least you
Mhm.
have some to go by.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what do did your husband have any part in helping you write this, or coming up with thoughts and themes?
He has a great, so I love him so much. For one thing, I asked if he would write for the book, and he said, "Sure, I'll write." And he said, "What do you want me to write about?" So he wrote for in the places where I wanted him to tell his side of the story, because I have my side, right?
Mhm.
And he's got his side, and sometimes they don't mesh.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that everybody should be thinking about when they're dealing with anybody, a stroke victim, a TBI victim, um, is that you have a whole group of people who are around you who care about you. And maybe they don't know exactly what you want, but they care about enough about you to be there. And I think that's, for me, that's really important. It changed my life because I found that I have more friends than I thought. And no matter how I got after the stroke, they were still there and are still there for me today.
Mhm. That's fabulous.
Yeah.
Um, so in your book, you talk, obviously you talk about your story and what happened, and um, moving as a whole person. I think that's such an interesting chapter title. So why don't you explain that one a little more?
Okay. Um, yeah. I find that moving as a whole person was starting out with me in Health South as a patient. And each one of the therapists actually moved me individually. I wasn't actually a whole person there. And I think that that's kind of a mistake, because when you deal with someone that's got any injury at all, especially a head injury, you have to look at how they're moving, how
Yeah.
they're thinking. Um, and I think that by having people treat me like parts, I
Mhm.
couldn't be a full person. That's one of the things I like about the holistic people that I've met along the way, because to them, I am the whole person. And if one part of me is off, they look at what's causing it. And sometimes what's causing my shoulder to be off is something not really, or at least in my mind, not really related to my heart, my shoulder.
Mhm.
So I get acupuncture all the time, and I ask him, "Well, why are you putting the pin down there?" He says, "Well, this is for your stomach." And I'm going, "Okay," but
Yep.
it works. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. And I know when I finally, got to the doctor that helped me, in functional neurology, they look at the entire body and the entire system.
yeah,
Like, just because your eyes aren't working together, we don't just target the eyes, we have to target the entire body with the eyes. Because just targeting, like you said, if you just target one thing, yeah, that one thing might get a little better, but then the shoulder's still not okay,
right.
or your gait's still not strong.
Yep.
So you really, And I think I'm hopeful that in the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to really see a really huge shift to more functional and holistic medicine
Yep.
in recovery.
Yep. I agree.
Yeah, I feel like, as patients demand that care, that's just the way the healthcare system has to start shifting.
Yeah.
Um, so you mentioned that you hired a PT for a
Hmm.
year.
Yeah.
Um, how did you go about that? And, did you have any struggles with your insurance
So I paid for it. My
out of
insurance
pocket?
company, yep, my insurance company didn't pay for it. So I found a woman at a women's health club, and my husband said, "This looks perfect." She is the second person I actually looked at. I found a um, physical therapist that worked very close to me, and I interviewed him. Actually, my husband and I interviewed him, and I wanted to hire him, but my husband said, "There's no way you're working with this man," because he really likes to push people, and I think he's going to push too hard.
Mm.
So I went with the women's club, and I found that I really liked her because she listened to what my body needed. And sometimes I really didn't know what I needed at the time. I just told her, well, I feel like this, and this thing has been happening to me at home. And so she actually made the situation work towards what I was feeling the day I went in for my therapy every time. I think that's really special.
And how often, you said you did for a year, but how often were you working with her?
Twice a week in the beginning.
Hmm.
And then as I got more and more set in how we were working out, it went down to once a week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you probably did exercises on your
Ev-
own in between.
every day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, and I think that's another really key point too is, even when I was done with my rehab, I was sent home with exercises and I did them every day. And I
Yeah.
still do that. I don't do them every day anymore, but I definitely still pull them out if I'm feeling off.
Mm-hmm.
I have the tools now in my toolkit.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important aspect. And I feel too often, and maybe this was your experience too, leaving the acute care and the outpatient, did they even send you home with stuff to continue doing, or was it just like goodbye? Have a
Oh
nice
no, they
day.
they sent me home with stuff, and I worked on it. But actually, I liked the exercises given to me by my physical therapist better than the ones they sent me home with. So I worked the ones in that she gave me and the ones they gave me out.
Yeah, well, at least you were sent home with something. I know very, very often people are sent home from the hospital with zero instruction
Oh, that
or direction.
that's
Um,
terrible.
Yeah, it is. It really is. And I recently met a woman and her son had an injury and he'd been in a coma, then he came out of his coma, he did acute care in the hospital. I believe he was in there maybe 6 months total. And then they're like, okay, bye, you're going home today. And they're like, okay, well, what's next? And they're like, oh, you're going home. You're good. You're alive. And she was like, well, what do we do next? And they're like, oh, nothing. There's nothing more to do.
Oh,
And unfortunately, that happens far too common.
yeah,
Um, and again, I really hope that in the next 10 years at least that we see a shift in that.
yeah. There needs to be a shift.
Mhm. So now you're almost 6 years out,
Hmm.
and do you feel like you're still continually improving, little by little?
Yeah, so it's gotten slower.
Mhm.
I still have a cramp in my right foot that cramps all day, every day, and I'd really like to figure out how to get rid of it.
Yeah.
I still have tinnitus in my left ear that I'd like to get rid of. And believe me, I've tried. I guess I'm learning to live with it,
Mhm.
but I still try new things if I find them. So I check out the doctor. I check out what he's going to do if he does anything. And if I like it and I know that it won't hurt me, I give it a try.
Yeah.
And so far, nothing's worked for those two things.
Have you done, I'm just curious, have you tried acupuncture on the foot?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So it's better than it used to be,
sure.
but it still cramps every day, all day.
Mhm.
One of the things I use to make it better is I use a TENS unit on it at night. So again, it makes it better, but it's still
Mhm.
futzy every day.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think it's so important for people to know that, there's always room for improvement no matter
Yeah,
how far out you are.
yeah,
And, it might be small. I know I obviously had my biggest gains during my intensive, but I still had a lot of gains in the probably 10 months following as I continued doing my exercises. And they were much more subtle, like I
yep.
wouldn't necessarily like notice that I had changes, but then I remember all of a sudden one day sitting at my computer and I was like, hey, I'm multitasking. And I hadn't multitasked, since my injury. So
Yeah.
um yeah.
So it's amazing. I took, I'm going to call them long sleeps. And when I woke up, I realized that I could do something better. And the last long sleep I had, it was 3.5 years after the stroke. And suddenly it felt like everything had finally shifted into place. I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I
Mhm.
feel like I'm like 95% there. The other 5% is taking a long time though.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it really is coming to a place of acceptance,
Yeah.
understanding, okay, and I feel like that's when I actually had my first breakthrough in my recovery, was when I finally said, okay, well, this might be the best I'm going to be, so I need to make the most of it, because we can
Mhm.
sit there and feel sorry for ourselves,
Mhm.
um but that won't get us better. You
Right.
have to really pull your big girl pants on and move forward, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be real easy to fall into the self-pity route.
Yeah.
So Marcia, any final thoughts and words of wisdom for our book club?
I think that we should never give up. It's that simple.
Period.
You know, you may try something and it doesn't work, but keep trying it because when you build neurofeedback or neuroplasticity,
Mhm.
that's what it takes. It's just time after time after time. And yes, it gets boring, but someday you'll wake up and you'll be able to maybe snap your fingers. And that's a really big deal for me.
Yeah.
So keep at it, and you will get better.
Yeah.
It may not be the way you were,
Mhm.
but it'll be better than you were the day before, and that's the part that matters.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Very, very good words of wisdom there, Marcia.
yeah.
Marcia, thank you so much for being our February book club. Um, Again, anyone who maybe hasn't gotten the book, we do have the link in the Facebook group. And then just a reminder, our March book, we just announced that last week. It's Pockets of Joy by Roxanne Battle. And my book cover looks different. I have one of the original books. So the current cover is yellow, that you guys have seen. I believe it's a yellow butterfly. But Pockets of Joy, it's a really short, sweet, easy to read book. I think it's only 100 pages. Yeah, 116 pages. So it's short, it's sweet, it's very, very inspirational. It's not at all TBI specific. So it's a little different. It's just more of a pick me up book. So I hope that you guys all get pockets of joy. And Roxanne will be in our book club doing her live author talk on, actually, it's Tuesday, March 31st. So we will have Roxanne here to talk about her book. You guys are going to love Roxanne. She's a former news anchor and she does a lot of public speaking, and she's fantastically inspirational. So I'm very excited for you all to meet her. And just another big thank you to you, Marcia.
Thank you
And
very much.
one of the best ways you guys can show your support for Marcia is to go on Amazon and leave a 5-star review of her book. It can just be as simple as a sentence. It doesn't have to be a long review. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much, Amy.